Alright, so here you can see the original reference photo of what we're gonna be painting today, the enlarged version of that so that I can see the details really well while I'm painting, and then the final prepped canvas for actual paint work. This is a canvas from a large box store. You can build your own canvas as well. It is covered with a gesso paint, and then we have a specific process we use, myself and the automotive shop that I work with, to prep these canvases for this amount of paint being applied, especially being automotive enamel. I transferred this image and sketch over to my final canvas using Ceril paper, which is a transfer paper that has a colored chalk on the back. This one happens to be red, but they also offer white, blue, black, and I think a couple other colors. You can get this at any of your big art stores or even Staples, I believe, and we'll have to do a video on transfer here in the near future. Today we're going to be using Alpha Black, Alpha Ivory, Alpha Speed Metal Gray, which is a dark gray, and Alpha White, an Alpha Light Gray, which I believe is called Grundy's Gray still. And then to tint these colors, we're going to be using an imitation gold to make the colors look a little bit vintage. For the brush set for this painting, we're going to use a kind of a collage of different ones. We have a MAC Tidwell Shady brush, a MAC Tidwell Little Bit brush. We have two brushes from the Broken Pinky set by Tidwell called the Pointy and the Mullet brush. And then we have two brushes from the Virus set from MAC called the Virus at the sizes of 4442 and 4441. So with any drawing, we start with the background first and then paint things as they move forward. So we're going to start with the border of the photograph and then move forward. I'm going to use a little bit of Alpha White and a little bit of Ivory to do this picture border on the outside. I'm going to start with a mullet brush by MAC Tidwell. The hairs are oiled, so I'm going to clean that off using a little bit of paint thinner. And I just get my brush all cleaned off to get that grease off of there. So again, my palette is just a good old Summit magazine. Here's Ivory and White, and I'm just going to kind of mix those together here on the palette. And I'm not going to worry about getting all the colors perfectly mixed here on the canvas, because the blessing of a vintage picture is that it's not perfect. So I'm actually going to tape the edges of this first, because on my last few locket paintings I just realized that I think a clean edge actually looks a lot nicer and more realistic, and what I'm trying to do with these is make them look as realistic as possible. So we're going to just tape this out. This is just Pro Band fine line tape in a certain size. You can use any size you want. Enamel and just add that directly to your palette, very close to the colors that you were just working with, and then also some black. And then I'll I'll have a clean bit of white so that I can mix directly on the canvas here. I don't know where all these little fuzzes are coming from. It's driving me nuts though. And I use the full extent of this brush to kind of get the color on, and then as it's still wet, you kind of have to work pretty quickly. I go in and grab my ivory paint, and you can kind of see how I start to add that color into the backdrop here. And I'm adding a tiny bit of that imitation gold into the ivory so that you get that antiqued color to it. And I'm using the whole brush. So from this, I'm not just using the tip, I'm using the whole flat brush to get these colors blended together quickly on the canvas. And sometimes you'll have too much of your original dark paint on your brush to get a nice light color, and if that's the case, you can go back through and actually clean your brush if you need to. Again, don't stress if the lines aren't perfect on the first run, because we can always go back through and add a layer of paint if we need to. So I'm just going in and adding a little bit more lightness to this, because on the picture that's how it is. It actually is not the right color gray whatsoever. I probably should have added a little bit of red to this to make it even a little bit more brown than a cool gray. So we may have to go back through and edit that. Once this layer is dry. It's all about layers, all about waiting for the paint to dry. And we're gonna get started on this ground down here. See how it looks a little bit peachier red. It's still not the right color. We're gonna add a little bit of imitation gold and maybe some more white. There we go. All right, so we're just gonna get this whole thing colored in pretty loosely. Again, using the whole brush, all the bristles laying flat on the canvas. And you can kind of see some of my other colors showing through, which is perfectly fine. I actually really like when that happens because it ties the painting together. It's just my style. We're doing a lot of what's called wet on wet blends, which means that you're not blending the paint on the palette, you're actually blending the paint on your actual painting on the canvas. That's my favorite way to mix colors anyway, because that way, like I said, you're bringing in that dirty paintbrush with other colors into your painting from other areas, and it really ties it all together. It really looks really cohesive at the very end. And I'm trying to do this while the paint is wet so that it has a nice blended quality to it, but it's not the final coat, so I'm not super worried about how clean it looks or anything like that. Will help you guys see my palette a little bit better. I'm going to clean my brush here. Not completely, because we're just going to go into a really dark color. Alright, so obviously not super clean, but it'll do. We're going to work on the first couple layers of the car. So I've actually cleaned 2 brushes. I've cleaned this little guy, the little pointy guy, which will help me get into those small little areas since this is such a small painting. And we're going to work off the picture and the tones on the picture as much as possible. So I'm going straight into just plain old black, maybe with a tiny bit of red to it. So just for the record, we've added a little bit of red, alpha red, to our palette to give a little bit of that warmth, browning kind of sienna color to our cool grays and grays and blacks. All right, so we're just gonna add straight up black to the canvas, which is scary. Filming is so challenging. Not comfortable painting like this. I am still getting used to doing all of this good stuff, filming and everything, so hopefully this will get you guys a better view of the palette while I'm mixing, because that's really important. And Mama doesn't have another camera just yet. All right. I guess the most important thing with this first layer of paint is to make sure that you know it is only a kind of map of where your final colors are going to go. So that means that it's an underpainting in artistic terms, and the thing to remember with underpaintings is that they are maps. They can be sloppy because they're going to be covered up again with a second layer of paint. So it kind of releases you from having to be perfect. And underpainting is an amazing way to be more confident in how the final piece is actually going to look once it's all said and done, because it gives you an idea of like the shapes and the colors. And maybe what needs changing a little bit, if you need to change anything. But the most important thing is when you're doing this, that you have a really quality reference photo that you have for the line work, and then a really quality line drawing that you have done previously, so that if a line gets messed up, you can go back to the drawing board, if you will. You can go back to your sketch and verify what's going on with that line, or how it's supposed to really look, because sometimes these blocks of color can really mess up your shapes. The actual shapes, especially if you're doing something like this, like it's a car, so you obviously have to be very precise, pretty precise, not very, but pretty precise with your line work. Once it's all said and done, it has to look like a car. It's not like a tree, something organic. So I'm going to speed this process up now that you know how the block thing is working. Well, no, let's do a few more. I'll do a few more blocks of color. I work with a very little size amount of paint on my palette, probably like the size a little bit smaller than a dime size bit of paint on my palette at a time. And even that is still too much sometimes, especially for a painting of this size. You end up, wasting a lot of it if you don't use it little bits at a time like that with the illustration. Pinstriping, it's a little bit different. You use a lot more paint in one painting than you do illustration at one time. So I'm just taking this small detail brush and going through and adding where all of the very blackest blacks are. and it's mostly in the shadows. I have no other paint on my brush at all. It's just straight black. And it doesn't look like there's a lot of other straight black areas on this painting. Maybe right here in this line. This is pretty black right here. Oops, you can see there's a little hair. Alright, so you kind of get the point. You're just going to go through with each tone that you make and fill in the shapes. So a better way to do this would say start with black, go through your black and white picture, see where all of the straight blacks are, fill in those spaces with that color, wash your brush, and then go to the next lighter tone, which would be like a charcoal gray. First, we're going to finish up these little black areas, painting these guys in. And as you can see, it kind of starts to come together pretty quickly once you get going and moving pretty fast. Once you get the idea of like, okay, there's black here, there's black here, there's black here, and then wash your brush, there's gray here, there's gray here, there's gray here. This is pretty dark. And you can move your canvas all around. You don't have to keep it just sitting on its side like this, but for me it helps me get rid of the idea that I'm painting something that is realistic. It helps me think of it more in like the abstract, which allows me to focus on the quality of the paint rather than what it's supposed to, like the actual image. It allows me to focus on how the paint is being applied, what colors, what shades. Alright, so that's kind of sloppy, but it works alright. I think her skirt's pretty black too. I'm gonna add. She's got some shadows right here. Alright, so I'm gonna move on to like a dark gray, which means that I'm taking the black paint that I already had here and I'm just adding a little bit of that Grundy gray to it to lighten it up just a tiny bit. Because from the bottle, the gray is going to be way too light. Just want it to be just a shade up from what I was working with so that I can mix it all together. And since the black is still kind of wet, I can kind of blend this in together. It looks really cool. A combination of the imitation gold and the red with a little bit of black actually makes a really beautiful vintage brown. Most people think black and white, but we're using what, 5 or 6 different colors to recreate this black and white photograph. That's why, to me, tattooing is so amazing, because they truly do only use black and skin tone to create their imagery when you see a black and gray tattoo. blocked in. You can see it's a little bit choppy. There's squint my eyes and I make sure that all the tones are as similar as I can get them to the original picture. So if you squint your eyes and you move back and forth between the picture and the painting, you've got, you know, the whites and the wheels that could probably be a little bit lighter, and I make a little note checklist. So the next time we go through this, it will be completely dry. I'm going to leave the tape on, and when we see you all next time, we're going to go through and do a full other coat of paint on all of these shapes to start defining these little highlights and shadows. Alright, and here we have the final painting. The background yellow color is a matte finish for now, and the photograph painting is a gloss finish. And the next step for this work is going to be taking it to the body shop that I work with, and they're going to wet sand this entire piece and then take it into their paint booth and shoot it with a gloss clear coat, which is going to encapsulate the artwork I painted by hand. And it turns out looking incredibly 3D and just a really cool final product.